a repeatable, scalable business model. And most businesses are looking for early adopters, right? You've got a new product, you're a startup, you need a particular kind of buyer, particularly if your product is something new or different that maybe the marketplace hasn't seen before. You need someone who's willing to be an early adopter, to use the word early evangelist in the book. And this is something that also goes back to Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. And the idea is that you need to get that early adopter, that early evangelist customer for your product, and until you find some of those, you're not getting any traction. I mentioned the word pivot a couple of times, and the word pivot is something that, based on feedback, you're making changes. And it's not a crisis. When you're subscribing to this methodology and you realize that your product is off the mark, well, join the club. Everybody's product's a little bit off the mark. You're lucky enough to discover it before you run out of your startup capital if you're new to this process. And the idea is to iterate without crisis and move into a fast and agile way to the next phase, towards customer validation. Product market fit is what you're after. So this is Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape and a prominent Silicon Valley investor. So you get your product market fit, you transition to growth, and then you go into growth. And this is the phase that you're in. And as a business, we're obviously searching for our product market fit, trying to get our product to get some traction. All this is managed with something called a build, measure, learn feedback loop. This is the way we look at the world on a day-to-day basis, where we're doing a very agile and iterative development process. That's very relevant for software companies, but just in general, we're getting that customer feedback, and our objective is to fastest time through the loop, so that we're learning and we're going through this feedback loop on a day-to-day basis. And we do this in the simplest of ways, right? We do simple A/B testing. In a restaurant, this might be testing 2 different menu items to see which are successful. But in our business, it could be something as simple as testing the color of the Get Started button to see which Get Started button color actually induces people to take action on our website. And certainly, this kind of continuous and incremental improvement is how we wind up improving any business. And this is the idea of actionable metrics. If you wait until the bottom of this list, till revenue, it's clearly too late. If you are only measuring revenue, like a lot of board of directors of startups do, and they sit around and they're looking at the revenue, by the time you've measured the revenue, you've completely missed the point. You've missed the boat. There was plenty of things you could have measured earlier on that were early indicators of success, and you could have optimized through A/B testing towards those early indicators of success and increased your likelihood of success. And instead of focusing on what they call vanity metrics in the book, you could have focused on actionable metrics. So how do you know you're getting it wrong? So how do you know that you didn't get enough customer feedback and you're getting all this stuff wrong? And basically, if you're spending a bunch of money on things like hiring sales personnel, expensive marketing, public relations, before you've really gotten the kind of validation from the marketplace that your product is in need, that's wanted, then you're probably out of sync. And you're doing what's called premature scaling. And it's really the number one thing that's causing businesses to fail. It's causing startups to fail, this out of sync mode. And here's a couple of examples of companies that I'll all take a look at. In some cases, you can chuckle at the story. Segway's certainly one. But of course, we're chuckling at the expense of the entrepreneurs and investors who were involved in these companies and ultimately lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Segway thought their market was everyone in the world who walked or had feet. Clearly, they maybe should have spent a little bit more time getting some customer feedback. They thought a big public relations campaign would somehow create demand where there was no demand. And a couple of $100 million lost later, they learned the hard way. Apple, prior to Steve Jobs, did the same thing with the Newton. They had a great product, but it was ahead of its time. And had they perhaps practiced in customer development, they would not have made these mistakes. Jaguar tried to put a Jaguar name on a Ford car, and there was no market for it. Had they done some research, they would have learned that. Sony wanted to push mini disc players down our throat. Now, I wanted one, but I was probably one of the few early evangelist kind of adopters who did want one when they were out. It didn't work here. It turned out they were popular in Japan, but U.S. citizens wanted no part of the mini disc player. And my favorite example is R.J. Reynolds, who determined that a smokeless cigarette was going to solve all the problems of smokers in the universe, and they were right. People who didn't smoke wanted smokers to use smokeless cigarettes, but unfortunately, people who don't smoke don't buy cigarettes. And people who do smoke had wanted no part of these smokeless cigarettes, and they lost $450 million in their effort. I mentioned before the idea of using it for things in other areas, and this is where sort of the far-reaching implications of the lean startup movement are actually perhaps best illustrated. Lean government is an oxymoron to some people, right? I mean, government's not lean, it's big and bureaucratic and kind of just wastes all of our tax dollars, right? But maybe not. Maybe going forward, those things can change a little bit. I mean, certainly, it's the state of affairs today. But here's one group, the Know Before You Owe initiative from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What they basically did, instead of creating a giant government bureaucratic agency with hundreds of employees and all sorts of overhead and expenses, and trying to ram an agenda down the throat of people that they're supposed to be serving, they went out in the most lean possible way, and they listened to the marketplace. They went out into a little local neighborhood, actually did one right here in the Bronx, and they went into laundromats, they hung up flyers, they had a local telephone number, and they gathered customer feedback. And they organically, based on that customer feedback, grew their program, used basically a minimally viable product, and built a service that was actually what the consumers were looking for. And the feedback that they got and the program that they created was therefore much leaner and much more successful and much more cost-effective than one had they developed it in a vacuum. So just to summarize the lean principles, because we're coming to the end and wrapping up here. The fastest, cheapest thing you can build with rapid cycles, get it into the hands of the customers fast, using customer development as opposed to product development, so that you can observe and measure the results using actionable metrics as opposed to vanity metrics, to make your product something that customers want, need, and love to buy. Validated learning. If they're buying it, that's your validation. If they're not buying it, you're not validated, and you've got to go through the loop again. So that's sort of lean in a nutshell. If you want to learn more about lean, in addition to the books, there's a project called Startup Genome. 650 companies in the initial study, 15,000 companies, including ours, are in the project. This project is very internet specific. It is out of Silicon Valley. And there's already some great data coming out of this study. Founders that learn are obviously more successful, learn the definition of what I talked about here today. Startups that pivot once or more are 2.5 times more likely to raise money. What that means is basically you wind up pivoting and changing direction instead of just sort of steadfast going after some vision that you might have had on your own. So if you pivot, you're likely to pivot because of customer feedback. Startups need 2 to 3 times longer to validate their market than most founders expect. So all founders think they have the best idea that ever was, and they run towards it, and they think it's going to be X period of time before they get it executed, but it always takes much longer. And that premature scaling is the most common reason for startups to perform worse. So they basically get out of sync, and they start thinking that they're in a place in their product market fit that's ahead of where they actually are, and they start doing things like hiring PR agencies or hiring VPs of sales, and that's why they fail, because they burn up their resources. So hopefully we can fix that. I want to talk a little bit about just Long Island. This is my 2 minutes about Long Island and why we need to do this year. So look at New York City. I don't know if you can see these numbers, but what this is basically saying is New York, really a tremendous amount of activity and money being raised in the first half of 2011. These numbers are 604 million compared to 757 million for San Francisco. A number of deals, 81 versus 103. These are basically private companies raising money for ventures. So what this is saying is that lean startup and this whole social and mobile phenomenon is creating a lot of high-tech startups. These numbers are courtesy of Great Lean Company, a VC based in New York. So New York's on the map. This shows a whole bunch of companies in New York. And on the far right, you see companies like Tumblr and Foursquare, other names that you may have heard of that have raised $50 and $100 million, 30 and 40 miles from where we're sitting here today. So this is happening on the East Coast. It's not happening on Long Island, unfortunately. I can't think of one Long Island company that's raised in the tens of millions of dollars towards the development of a successful high-tech mobile or social startup. And clearly, it would be nice if Long Island could participate even more so this time around in the tech boom that's happening. I remember the Silicon Alley days It was what motivated Rich and Peter and I and the others to create ListNet. And we're motivated again. I mean, social and mobile was almost as much of a technology party as the internet was back in the mid-90s. So we're going to make ourselves this time a seamless extension of the New York City tech scene. We're going to create something called the ListNet Lean Startup SIG. Our objective is we're going to have meetups, cocktail hours, bring in presenters, have conversations, roundtables, and we're going to get those app developers, those social and mobile app developers in particular, out of their basements. And we're going to get them learning the lean concepts, and we're going to get them connected with the resources and the business people and lawyers and the financing and whatever else they need here on Long Island, like we've always done as ListNet. But we're going to use this startup story to help bring them out of the woodwork so that we can help grow the ListNet membership and help the Long Island economy and help grow our tech sector, which is something that we're all motivated to do. One more thing, we're in search of early evangelists, so one little plug for myself. If you know any large retailers that are looking for ways to use social media, we need to get out of the building, right, because that's part of the process, and meet some early evangelists so that we can find product market fit. So anybody knows any retailers, please let me know. Give us a ring. Our current site, we have about 200 retailers signed up, but about 50 that are live on the site today. And again, most of the larger retail brands that you would know across the country that we're carrying and promoting their gift cards. So my closing thoughts, you can apply lean principles in places beyond just startups. They really are wherever you face uncertainty about what customers will want. And if you efficiently use these things in your life, I think you're going to wind up with products and you're going to have better success with your innovation, because your innovation could be misguided, even again by a few degrees, could be the difference between success and failure. And we really need the business leaders, including the people in this room, to embrace the idea that these lean startup principles are important, and hopefully we can do that and get our heads around it and have more success in innovation here on the island, not just in the tech sector. If you want to get involved, if you want to get more questions, you can reach out to me directly, or you can call the ListNet office and get information about how to get involved with the Lean Startup SIG in the first meeting that's going to take place. So that's it. Those are the books again. That's my contact information. And thank you very much.